This is Mr. Johnson, and today we'll be talking about Charles Darwin and his voyage of discovery. And here's just a picture of Charles Darwin a little bit later in his years, and just a little background information about Charles Darwin and his contribution to science. He was born in England in 1809, and later in his life he came up with what's known as the theory of evolution. All right, and essentially evolution states that modern organisms, so that's organisms that are current or alive right now, have evolved over long periods of time and through the descent of common ancestors. So that means that an organism that's alive right now had to evolve, or the population evolved over a long period of time, and essentially all organisms share common ancestors. And he was invited to sail on the ship, the HMS Beagle, and he was on that ship for about 5 years. And when we think about Charles Darwin and his journals, and the organisms that he talked about the most, we hear about the finches and the marine iguanas and the tortoises, and all of those organisms were located on what are called the Galapagos Islands. All right, so just some observations that came about aboard the Beagle. Here's just a map of the route that the ship ended up taking, and the main reason this ship, the HMS Beagle, left Europe and went around the globe here is that they wanted to map the coastline of South America. And you can see all the red dots here around South America, and those are some of the major stops that they made. And while they were mapping the coastline of South America, Charles Darwin got off the boat and hiked around and picked up specimens and looked for fossils and wrote in his journal. And so he ended up filling his notebooks with observations about the different species he saw. And since he visited so many different places and saw so many different organisms, and even organisms on different continents that looked similar to each other, he ended up keeping his eyes and his mind open for larger patterns. And so, he thought like a scientist, and he wanted to make connections between all these different organisms. And he noticed 3 distinctive or different patterns of what's known as biological biodiversity. One of the first things that he noticed is that species vary globally. All right, so we're thinking on a global scale here, all across the earth. And he visited a wide range of habitats. He went to South America, he went to Australia, and he went to Africa. And what he found is that different species, yet ecologically similar, inhabited separate but similar habitats around the globe. And so the example that we could use here is that this bird up here he found in South America, and this bird is what's known as a ree. All right, and rees are large birds, but they're flightless. They cannot fly. And he also visited Africa and found these birds, which are also large flightless birds, and these are what are known as ostriches. And then he even found emus, which are also large flightless birds, in Australia. And these 3 different birds are, different species, yet they actually live in similar habitats around the globe. And even just looking at some of the pictures here, we see that the ree, the ostrich, and the emu all live in some type of grassland. Yet they're similar species, but they're not exactly the same. And so this is what Charles Darwin called that species vary globally. He also found out that species vary locally. And this is a picture of a close-up of all the Galapagos Islands, which is located off the west coast of South America. And we can see here that the islands are, they're close together, but they're also separated. See that they're separated by water. And what he found is that there were different yet related animal species which occupied different habitats within a local area. And so the Galapagos Islands there is, considered a local area. And the example that we use here are what are known as these land tortoises. And this first one here is the Isabella Island tortoise. And this tortoise is located on Isabella Island. And what Darwin found is that it had a dome-shaped shell, but one of the best findings or evidence is that it had a very short neck. And the reason that these tortoises had short necks is because on Isabella Island, the habitat that they lived on, the vegetation was on the ground. And so it was really close, and so their necks were rather short because they just had to lean over and eat the vegetation there. But what he also found was the Hood Island tortoise. And here's a picture of one of them. And you can see that these have a curved shell. It's not as dome shaped, it's just curved. But what's really striking is the actual long neck. And the reason these Hood Island tortoises have these long necks is because the vegetation that they had in their habitat was located up higher. So there wasn't a lot of vegetation on the ground for them to eat. And so they ended up having to stretch their necks up to eat that vegetation. And so locally here, we can see that species, vary. They're similar, but they are actually two different species. And last, Darwin found that species vary over time. And he collected fossils during his travel as well as living organisms. And he noted that some of the fossils of extinct animals, so those are animals that are no longer around, were actually similar to living species. And so here's a picture of a glyptodont. And obviously we don't see too many glyptodonts roaming around right now. But you can see how similar the glyptodont is to the modern species of the armadillo, which we see quite all over the place. And this evidence here suggests that a certain species can change over time by some type of natural process. And so all this evidence that Darwin collected, he went home and he started thinking about it, putting all the pieces of the puzzle together to explain all these different findings.